Hi, everyone. It looks like no one's here today, so it'll just be me speaking, at least for now. We might see someone pop in just a couple of minutes, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. First, before we get into talking about the reading for today, I just want to remind you all once again that your first draft outline for your group podcast is due on Wednesday. So it's due tomorrow, April 10th. So if you are still sort of confused on what you need to do, always feel free to check in with me, and I'm happy to help you in any way. All right, it looks like we just had someone join in, so give me just a second and we'll add Joe to the conversation. Hi, Joe. Hello.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. I had just started and I was just reminding everyone about the outline that's due tomorrow. So do you have any questions about that before we move forward?
None that are broad enough for the class. I have an individual question for our group, but that we could take care of that afterwards.
Okay. All right. So we'll get to that in just a second. So let's go ahead and get into the reading and see where that takes us.
Okay.
All right. So today's reading is called Just Emotions, and we could take that in multiple ways, like not just emotions. We could talk about justice and emotion. And she's very purposeful about using that language because she likes to sort of play on the words. But what we're going to focus on today is quickly I'll talk about a field known as affect studies, which is what this article is getting into, and in the next article we'll talk about, and its relationship to rhetoric. So it's still a relatively new field, and rhetoricians are just now attaching themselves to it. We'll also talk about what Sarah Ahmed means by stickiness of emotion. So we're going to use some direct quotes from her reading to help us better understand that. And then finally, we'll identify how she sees emotions operating as society starts to shift. So yeah, we'll get to that. All right, so that's the plan. So to start things off, I know that this slide is a little bit flashy, but it's flashy on purpose. When I talk about affect, some of the ways that theorists describe this is sort of like the sparkling, glittering part of us as individuals. So in other words, affect is something that's constantly changing, and it changes depending on like who's looking at it, the space that you're in, the time of the day. All of those things affect someone's affect. And something that's really important here is that, first of all, everyone knows that I'm not misspelling affect. It's not effect, but it's affect, which typically we think of as affected, the verb, but this is the noun, and it has to do with body's reaction to the things around it. All right, so think about affect as the step before we feel emotion. Joe, is that making sense?
Yes, it is.
Okay, cool.
I was just taking notes, so if it looks like I'm not paying attention, I'm just trying to.
Totally fine. Yeah, you're the only one who shows up usually, so I am not judging you at all. But yeah, so that's something that's really important because I think sometimes affect is used interchangeably with emotion. In fact, Sarah Ahmed typically does that, the reading that we're doing today. But there is a little bit of a distinguishment between affect, which is the way I react, and then I register my emotion based on the way society has told me I should register my emotion. So this field relates to rhetoric in a lot of ways. I mean, we can get all the way back to classical rhetoricians when they're talking about emotions, right? But a lot of rhetoricians focused on the way the person doing the speaking influences everyone else and influences their emotions. So typically rhetoricians were more about how I, as a speaker, could influence everyone else. Affect study is more about how everyone else is starting to be affected by the words of the rhetorician. So that's the main difference from some of the other ways that rhetoric has studied emotion. Another relationship we can build really quick, and then we'll just move forward, is when Kenneth Burke talked about motion versus action. And remember, he said motion is something that happens in nature all the time. And it's something that we as humans are doing all the time, right? It's something that we are doing without any sort of conscious choice. We do it because we have to do it. Affect is very similar to that. Like sometimes we laugh without realizing like why we're laughing. Like it's just a natural bodily reaction. The emotion part is when we get into, according to, like if we want to link it to Burke, action. Right? So that's where we start to be very conscious about how we are reacting to whatever we just saw. Does that relationship make sense, Joe?
Is it like it coincide with like his symbolic action, like along those lines a little bit, but maybe like a different tense? I guess not as symbolic action is more on the reaction linguistically, right?
Symbolic action is like when you're consciously using those symbols.
Okay.
Right? So you know that you're using them. So that would be related closer to emotion.
Okay.
But remember that reading that we did where he talked about motion and how we're always in motion. And some examples of that is like breathing, digestion.
Yeah.
Affect is on that end of the spectrum. So it's motion. It's something we cannot control.
Okay.
And there are other relationships that we might try to build throughout today's discussion. But one of the reasons I wanted to do this is I know some of you are starting to work on your final paper, and I want you to start building some relationships between readings. So that way, when you get to that final paper, you're not trying to put together things that just don't really click.
Okay.
All right. Let's go ahead and move on. And if you have questions, we'll sort of dig into them in a second. So affect's relation to politics is very similar to rhetoric's relationship to it. So we can think about how, like this slide helps us think about how when we are given promises by the government or by politicians on either side, like I promise that your life will be better than your parents' life, right? Something like that. Or I promise that you'll be able to get a job after college. Those types of promises. When we're not able to do the things that we were promised by politicians, our body is weighed down by those things. And we don't initially realize why it's weighed down. It just happens, right? Because we've been working so long to like get the thing that we've been told we were supposed to get. Society plays a role in telling you why your body is feeling the way that it's feeling. So a good example of this is typically when somebody doesn't get the job that they were sort of promised by the government, that individual is talked into blaming themselves. And so what happens is like they register that affective reaction of, disappointment or whatever as sort of frustration with themselves, and then they go internally, right? Or maybe they blame it on someone else outside of them.
Okay.
Right. But so, for example, like blaming immigrants, I think some people would do that. Right. So affect and politics relate because we have to figure out what happens when our body is actually affected and affected by politicians' broken promises.
Okay.
Can you think of any other promises that are broken that maybe we have to like figure out how we feel about those things?
I was just thinking about like your parents or something back in the day. I wasn't going politics with it. I was just trying to relate to like, I guess that feeling that you get like if you're told something, if you're taken for ice cream, if you get good grades or something, and then that never happens. I don't know, might be dumbing it down a little bit, but that little internal conflict or that weighing, because it still does have an effect on you. It's like you're like, did I do something wrong? Like, is it?
Yeah, or like you don't know, like if you didn't get a good grade and like you don't know if it was you're to blame or your teacher's to blame, and it's almost like you have to spend some time working through that disappointment that is in your body and then registering where that feeling is supposed to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's move on. And this is just some general ideas about where affect and is important when we're thinking about politics and rhetoric. But so typically in class, and for those of you who are like struggling with trying to build relationships, I suggest doing this activity on your own. I'm going to give you some quotes, and I'll actually work through this. So Joe, I know these quotes are hard. I'm not going to make you do this yourself. But I suggest that some of you work through them and try to relate them to some of the previous readings. So I'm not going to do that second thing very much. But again, if you're working on your final paper, you need to start building these relationships. So that's just a suggestion. But Joe and I are going to talk about some of these quotes, and we'll try to decipher what Sarah Ahmed is trying to say. So the first one that I felt like was really important is on page 153. And I know you can all read this, but I'll read it just to sort of give us not awkward silence. So it says, emotions work to differentiate between others precisely by identifying those that can be loved, those that can be grieved. And then she says a little bit more, but then by constituting some others as the legitimate objects of emotions. So this is one of the core arguments that she's trying to make here. And she says it over and over in different ways. But what she initially is trying to point out is that our society tells us who we are supposed to care about, right? So who we are allowed to feel sad for or happy for, right? And so what ends up happening is the ones that we're allowed to feel happy for and sad for, they become like real things, real subjects, real humans. And all the rest of us that aren't allowed to be cared for are not as real as everyone else. Before we think of examples, is this making sense, Joe?
Yeah.
Okay, so can you think of anyone that like we are typically told that we are supposed to feel sorry for if they're in trouble?
That we're typically told that we're supposed to feel sorry for, like in society, or
if a group were in trouble, which group should we like feel sorry for? Like, in which one should we not feel sorry for? This has to do with age.
Women, children, I don't know, the elderly.
Yeah. So that's an argument that she's trying to make. Like when we go to war or something, the pictures that we typically sort of that pull at our heartstrings are the ones that are the children, right? Mm-hmm. And the children that are being hurt by war. And all of a sudden, that can really turn the support in the United States for that war into a lack of support for that war, right? And she's not making the argument whether that's good or bad. She's just saying that that typically is what happens. And what she's trying to like get us to question is, should that be the case? And what happens to, like, why shouldn't we be worried about the men who are also having to deal with this, right? Especially the men, I would just say men overall, right? I won't even say soldiers versus not soldiers. I think it's just interesting that we are supposed to care about even women, the women who are mothers, right? Rather than all the other women. So she is starting us off, getting us thinking through that. So I'm going to bring up another quote, and it'll add another layer to what she's trying to say, unless you have any questions. Do you?
No, go ahead. I'm picking that up now.
Okay, cool. Sorry, let me see. There we go. All right, so this is adding another layer. She says, to be moved by the suffering or some others, the deserving poor, the innocent child, like we just talked about, the injured hero, is also to be elevated into a place that remains untouched by others, whose suffering cannot be converted into my sympathy or admiration. So the example that we were just talking about, all of a sudden when we start to mourn the innocent child, we bring that child from, let's say, Syria up into the hierarchy, right? The Americans are still up here, right? They're still at the top, but we have the Syrian child here. Everyone else in Syria is like way down, not even accommodated for. Mm-hmm. So the Syrian child is the other, and everyone else is the other.
Okay.
And they're the ones who become invisible. Another example we could think about here in the United States is like, as we talk about Black Lives Matter, right? So we still have a group that's way up here. Black Lives Matter brings up Black lives, but then we might be leaving out Native Americans.
Yeah, other minorities, right? Or
exactly, like maybe immigrants, right? Multiple. So it's really important that you see that like what's happening here is that we're still creating a hierarchy and we're still maintaining our power at the top of the hierarchy.
Okay.
Are you with me?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you see some relationship to anything that we've talked about?
Oh, most definitely. Yeah, I kind of got that. I was lost and like I was taking too much thinking about if our emotions were a result of something like that, or like caused by looking at how it like systematically is still like oppressive in nature, in terms of being inclusive in society, and that's what helped here a little bit more.
Yeah.
In understanding that.
Yeah. So probably like the ideology reading would be one that would be a really close match with this, because we're talking about that hierarchy that Althusser was really concerned about.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. Any other comments or questions?
No, not on this particular topic. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So that's the first thing she's trying to do, is get us to think about the hierarchy that's happening. The next thing that she does is she moves us to start talking about what it means to do some actions over and over and over again. So on page 155, she says, the moment of contact is shaped by past histories of contact, which allows the proximity of a racial other to be perceived as threatening, at the same time reshapes the body in the contact zone of the encounter. So this is a lot, but as I said, she's trying to get us to think about these interactions that we're having and how that affects the way we feel about other people. So what she's telling us is that sometimes histories can make us feel like something is true, and then as we experience something new, we don't allow for it to be something different. We just allow for it to reinforce our understanding of that particular group of people. And after it reinforces it, it's sort of like it just keeps doing it over and over, because like before we get into race or anything, you could think about this as like a haunted house. So you go into a haunted house. The past history of the haunted house is that, well, everyone knows it's haunted, right? And so you've gone into it and you have this knowledge and you hear like all these weird things, like maybe it's a mouse scurrying over it. Who knows what it is? Mm-hmm. But because there's some history of being haunted, you, especially if you're not like thinking critically, and she of course is saying that most of us are not, you think, oh yeah, this place is haunted. And then you leave and you tell everyone, I know other people say this, but I've seen it to be true. Right. And so she's saying that like that creates this sort of stickiness around a particular feeling of a house or a certain group of people, where we have a hard time detaching ourselves from it because it gets stickier and stickier and stickier. Are you with me so far?
Yeah, so it's kind of using either past experiences or feelings on something that is not necessarily fact, but it's kind of by your rhetoric or whatever, or what you're speaking is kind of like reaffirming that for it to be true, kind of in a way, to others, like passing that on. Yeah.
Like you felt it because you thought you were going to feel it.
Okay.
You've been told you were supposed to feel it. Like, for example, if you assume a group of people, like someone walks in and they're from a group that you think is going to be stealing something, and you like own the shop.
Yeah.
So even if they don't steal something, right? Everything that you're reading their body in a way that's like, they're sketchy. Mm-hmm. And so they leave, even though they didn't get caught, they didn't steal anything. You then tell your friends, oh man, I saw this woman and blah, blah, like maybe, I think sometimes people assume people who are homeless, right? And so I saw this person, I know they were going to steal something. They didn't do it. But you telling that story makes that emotion of like feeling mistrustful of this group become even stickier.
by actually questioning your own like thoughts, like why did I have that thought going into my head, or why, and then not giving value to that person as being like, oh, they're a good person. They just really just needed a candy bar and a soda or something, whatever it is. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And the stickiness is important because the stickiness makes us avoid questioning that, right? Because we're so stuck to this thing that we feel. She's making, she's thinking about racial bias in a way that connects to our feelings rather than a way that connects to like just rationality.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a big problem in itself. Like just in this like era that we're in now, it's like there's not like we're still holding back on the things on like both sides of the spectrum, like all races, it's like it's one minute you think you're going 2 steps forward and the next minute, it's like getting reaffirmed by like stuff like that kind of, you don't realize that it's just your inward or your thinking is kind of wrong, and then you externalize whatever you externalize ends up being just patterns what's wrong in society also.
Exactly. Yeah. And she's saying we need to think more about the way our feelings are shaping those things and less about like, let's give us statistics, because the stats, I mean, she doesn't get into the stat stuff, but when she does get into things like justice and emotion, like the things that you were asked for the reading questions, she's trying to say that like our understanding of fact and justice is emotionally connected to our feelings, our affect, right? And so she wants to remind us that it can't be one or the other. We really need to think about how that feeling is affecting our understanding of that fact.
So what she was trying to say with the questions you asked, and I think I either got them backwards or I might have mixed them up on the actual readings.
Yes.
Is it the injustices are created and like kind of I can't think of the word. They're basically reaffirmed through our emotions, or and then I think I mixed myself up saying that we got that our emotions were based off of the social injustices, which I don't think was what the reading was.
So she's saying that our emotions are wrapped together with justice. And so that first quote that we used at the beginning is trying to tell us that we can be concerned about the injustice against children or against someone who is seemingly innocent because of our emotional attachment to those particular individuals. It has nothing, or it has little to do with the factual understanding of whether this person is innocent or not. And that's what she wants us to get at, is that like justice is not a separate thing. Fact is not a separate thing.
Okay.
And when we feel injustice for a child, that feels different than we feel injustice for like an older man, especially an older man of color, right? Because we might say, well, maybe he shouldn't have been in that place.
Yeah.
Whereas for the child, we would say, oh my gosh, I can't believe we wouldn't. Yeah. Exactly. We would never blame the victim in that particular case. And she's not saying what's right or wrong. She's just saying that this is the thing that's happening. Are you with me on this?
Yeah, definitely. My mind's just thinking about like all those kinds of like how they get subcategorized based on emotions and stuff like that.
This is why this stuff is so important, because this is getting at like the affective, or this is getting at like facts, like alternative facts that we talked about last week, and how like our emotions are wrapped up in all of those things. But we don't realize it because we haven't really been talking about emotion in most of our schooling. Right?
Yeah.
We said it's black and white, and it isn't. But feelings has something to do with it. Anyways, okay. Any other questions before it? This is one that I'm like really into. So.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I think we have 2 more quotes. So I'm going to do. Let's see. Actually, we just talked about this one. So I'm not going to repeat this one, but just know that when we feel like justice is done and we're happy about it, there's a certain social norm that's telling us to be happy about it, right? And or telling us not to be, or telling us to question it, depending on who the person is.
Yeah.
So she's telling us that, like, when we're happy, we need to think about why we are happy, and whether that has to do with the categories that we've sort of been told to focus our happiness towards. Is that making sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So this one reinforces what we were just saying. So I'm going to get to the last one. And this is what she's getting towards. This is what she's getting to for this whole reading. And this is from a book. But she says, a good scar allows healing. It even covers over. But the covering always exposes the injury, reminding us of how it shapes the body. This is on one of the last pages. So what she's saying here is that we need to bring the people who are maybe the people who are the others, or the people who are even the others, we need to bring their healing to the forefront and continue to talk about it and allow for it for them to heal, but don't allow for it to completely be erased from our history. She's telling us that we need to talk about the ugly and the beautiful. And until we can do both with emotion and not just with facts, we're not going to be able to heal as a society from whatever has happened in the past. So I'm being vague because there's a lot of different things that we need to heal from, but a specific example could be like slavery, right? Mm-hmm. That would be like 9/11 is a more recent example, which is something we'll talk more about next class. Can you think of any other ones that you feel like our society as a whole probably needs to figure out how to heal from?
Well, just because it's on the top of my head, is obviously like gun violence, stuff like that, and I like sometimes it's just, you don't realize that we're accustomed to moving through like these emotions so quickly now that it's like, okay, well, come on, that was like 2 months ago. Like, you should be over now. Like, come on, you shouldn't be scared of like, of going out in public, or your whatever the emotions are tied to those, and then kind of at the same time, got to have a level conversation about it and respect what they've been through, but they should also understand that, not the whole world's not like that type of place, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really what she is trying to get us to think about, is like, we need to talk about the emotions that are a result of some of these things, not just talk about these things.
And if you were doing this for, say, not the podcast, but the paper, I mean, would you even tie this into invitational rhetoric a little bit, slightly? I mean, at least this last part, I mean, that you're ending off with, I kind of was thinking about that, like kind of.
For sure. Yeah. And like the way invitational rhetoric could be really great is if they do allow for us to talk about like the healing process, the scars that we have, and continue to talk about that, right? I think sometimes invitational rhetoric becomes like, oh, we're just being nice and it's over. But Sarah Ahmed and I think Foss and Griffin are saying we need to like put our feelings on the table and get through this, and bring it up whenever we need to, in order to make sure that we're still healing and we haven't broken that wound back up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that would be a good one to look at, and then you could sort of look at like a speech of maybe one of the kids who dealt with gun violence, right? So some of the Parkland kids I know gave some really good speeches. And so you might be able to identify how they're inviting us to look at these scars and to start to heal using both rationality and emotion.
Yeah. And I think there's, as of recently, I know that there was like a couple people that, like, I don't know if it's that shooting, it's that common now, but that they're like suicide, and they're talking about like, it's not really over, just because, the guy's been either killed, put in jail, tried, or whatever, people have been buried, doesn't mean like, it's that the conversation should be over, like we're still dealing with it, and kind of that nature, adds to that.
Yeah. And that's on both an individual. I think it's important to consider the individual level too, right? Yeah. Because
that's more individual. Yeah.
But still, I mean, she's talking macro and micro. This can work on all of these levels, because I would say on a macro level, we haven't healed either, right? I mean, last year at the end of the semester when we had the threats, I mean, a part of me, you know, because I do all this reading, so I know rationally that like something could happen at any moment.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like it really did trigger an affective response. Like sometimes when I was on campus, I felt goosebumps without even realizing that I was a little bit scared.
I kind of, and it probably deals a little bit with this because being in the military and being kind of emotionally numb sometimes to that kind of stuff, you know, you don't realize it. And then, so for a long period of time, I never had to be on campus, you know, anything like this. And so that, yeah, last summer. So when that started going on and then the Thousand Oaks, I started to realize like, okay, now I kind of understand how these people's emotions are. Cause like, then I was like, okay, now I'm a little bit, you know, a little scared there to be there. And so when I started feeling, I'm like realizing like it kind of changed, like, okay, you can't always just like, oh, it's never going to happen type thing, because, you know, you don't really know how it feels until you're actually in like an environment you're not supposed to be in. You know, obviously war is totally different than like a school. And so when you're there and you experience those type of feelings in school, it kind of opens your eyes up. So I think it's understanding those types of things, you know, that help your emotions. And then also, you know, dealing with what other people, you know, have to say or how they deal with that kind of stuff
exactly too. Yeah. And recognize that like if they're a part of like an other group or even just an other group, they might be dealing with those sorts of things, those sorts of wounds, and healing from them in different ways. Yeah Cool. Well, I'm glad. I mean, I hate talking about that sort of stuff, but I'm glad that we did, because it is a really good example of what Ahmed is trying to get at with this reading. So yeah, thank you.
Of course.
Okay, well, so I know you have a question, so let me just wrap things up really quick, and then me and you can talk in just a second. But do you have any other questions about the reading?
No, you answered most of them.
Okay.
I was slightly confused, but I think it was just the way I was interpreting the message. But once we went over this, I kind of get what the goal of the article is about. Yeah,
and she's tough, so that's why I pulled the quotes. Okay, so those of you who are listening still, make sure that if you were to use this in your essay, you definitely need to talk about that idea of stickiness and the way that, like, as we constantly do things, feelings become even more sticky. And I would also suggest talking about this whole healing process, because those are two of the really important things that she's getting at. It's not just about emotion, but it's about like how we work through these emotions and how we create sort of stereotypes attached to them. All right, all right, thank you all for listening, and always let me know if you have questions.